They say a mother's love is unconditional, but what happens when that love becomes a weapon used against you? My name is Louise Mitchell, and at 73 years old, I thought I had seen every kind of betrayal life could offer. I was wrong. The deepest cut would come from the person I brought into this world, nurtured, sacrificed for, and loved without question for 38 years. This is the story of how my own son tried to steal my independence, my dignity, and ultimately, my life savings. But more importantly, this is the story of how I fought back and reclaimed what was rightfully mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What you're about to hear isn't just another family drama. It's a wake-up call for every parent who has given everything to their children, only to discover that gratitude has an expiration date, and blood doesn't always guarantee loyalty. Some of you listening might recognize pieces of your own story in mine. Others might be heading down the same path I traveled, blind to the warning signs that I missed for far too long. I never imagined that a simple Sunday dinner would become the catalyst for the most painful chapter of my life. But perhaps I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs along a trail I was too trusting to follow. Looking back now, with the clarity that only comes from surviving betrayal, I can see how carefully orchestrated everything was. How my son Marcus had been laying the groundwork for months, maybe even years, preparing for the moment when he would strip away everything that made me feel human. That particular Sunday in October started like any other. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and apple cinnamon from the candles I had lit throughout my house. I had spent the morning preparing Marcus's favorite meal, pot roast, with all the fixings, the same recipe I had been perfecting since he was a little boy who would climb onto a kitchen chair to help me stir the gravy. Even at 73, I still found joy in cooking for my family, still believed that food was love made tangible. My hands, weathered by decades of caring for others, moved with practiced efficiency as I set the dining room table with my grandmother's china. The same china that had graced Sunday dinners for 3 generations. The same plates that had held birthday cakes and holiday feasts, celebration meals and comfort food during times of sorrow. Each piece held memories, stories whispered through, the delicate rose pattern that had somehow survived wars, moves, and the passage of time. Marcus arrived with his wife Jennifer and their 2 children, Emma and Jake, ages 12 and 14 respectively. I had always been close to my grandchildren, the kind of grandmother who remembered every school play, every soccer game, every milestone that mattered to them. Emma, with her curly auburn hair and freckled nose, was growing into a beautiful young woman with dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Jake, tall for his age and serious beyond his years, shared my love of history and would spend hours listening to my stories about the old days. But something felt different that afternoon. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite identify, a careful quality to their interactions that reminded me of actors rehearsing their lines. Jennifer, usually warm and chatty, seemed nervous, avoiding my eyes as she helped set out the serving dishes. The children were unusually quiet, exchanging glances that spoke of secrets shared and instructions given. Marcus himself appeared agitated, checking his phone repeatedly and making comments about traffic and road conditions that seemed oddly pointed. At 42, my son had grown into a successful insurance adjuster, a man who made his living assessing damage and determining fault. Perhaps I should have realized that he was assessing me with the same clinical detachment he brought to his work. We sat down to dinner, and for a while, everything seemed normal. I served generous portions of pot roast, mashed potatoes, and green bean casserole while asking about school, work, and weekend plans. Emma told me about her science project on animal behavior, and Jake shared his excitement about an upcoming field trip to a Civil War battlefield. These were the moments I treasured most, the simple pleasure of being surrounded by family, of feeling needed and valued. But as the meal progressed, I began to notice the careful way Marcus was steering the conversation. He mentioned friends of his whose elderly parents had given up driving. He talked about statistics he had supposedly read about accident rates among senior citizens. He brought up a news story about an elderly driver who had accidentally hit a pedestrian in a nearby town. Each comment felt like a small stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of unease that gradually built into waves. Jennifer nodded, along with everything Marcus said, adding her own observations about how scary it was to see older drivers on the road. She mentioned her grandmother, who had voluntarily given up her license at 85, as if this were some kind of noble sacrifice that all elderly people should aspire to make. The children remained quiet, but I could see them watching me, carefully as if they were waiting for something to happen. I tried to change the subject several times, asking about their vacation plans and Jennifer's new job, but Marcus kept returning to the topic of elderly drivers like a dog with a bone. Finally, as I was clearing the dinner plates and bringing out the apple pie I had baked that morning, he dropped the bombshell that would change everything between us. "Mom, we need to talk about your driving." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire you can't quite locate. I set the pie down carefully on the table, my hands suddenly unsteady, and looked at my son with confusion and growing alarm. "What about my driving, Marcus?" "Jennifer and I have been talking, and we're concerned. You're 73 years old, and we think it might be time for you to consider giving up your keys." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the same clock that had marked time in my family for 3 generations. I looked around the table at the faces of my loved ones, searching for some sign that this was a joke, some indication that my son hadn't just suggested taking away one of the most fundamental aspects of my independence. "I don't understand," I said slowly. "Has something happened? Have I had an accident? Have I done something wrong?" Marcus shook his head, but his expression remained serious, almost stern. "It's not about what you've done, Mom. It's about what could happen. You're getting older. Your reflexes aren't what they used to be. And frankly, we're worried about you and about other people on the road." I felt heat rising in my cheeks, a combination of embarrassment and anger that made my heart race. Here, I was in my own home, surrounded by the family I had loved and supported for decades, being told that I was too old, too incompetent, too dangerous to do something I had been doing safely for over 50 years. "My reflexes are fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've never had an accident, never gotten a ticket, never had any problems with my driving. I just renewed my license last year and passed all the tests with flying colors." "That's not the point," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the patient, condescending tone that adults use with small children. "The point is prevention. We don't want to wait until something happens. We want to be proactive." Jennifer nodded enthusiastically, as if Marcus had just proposed something wonderfully thoughtful instead of something that would essentially trap me in my own home. "We've already looked into transportation services for seniors," she added. "There are companies that can take you grocery shopping, to doctor's appointments, anywhere you need to go." The implications of their words hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just talking about taking away my car. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They were talking about taking away my freedom, my ability to come and go as I pleased, my capacity to live independently. They were essentially proposing to turn me into a dependent, someone who had to ask permission and make appointments just to buy milk or visit a friend. "I appreciate your concern," I said, fighting to maintain my composure. "But I'm perfectly capable of driving. I drive carefully, I avoid heavy traffic when possible, and I've never given anyone reason to worry about my abilities behind the wheel." "Mom, you're being stubborn," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't about what you think you can do. This is about reality. You're an elderly woman, and elderly people have accidents. It's not personal, it's just facts. The word elderly stung more than I expected. It was true that I was 73, but I didn't feel elderly. I felt like myself, the same Louise Mitchell who had raised this ungrateful son, who had worked full-time while caring for his every need, who had sacrificed her own dreams to ensure he had every opportunity. I felt like the woman who still gardened, still volunteered at the library, still maintained her own home and managed her own affairs without help from anyone. I am not just an elderly woman, I said, my voice sharper now. I am your mother, and I am a human being who deserves to be treated with respect, not like some kind of hazard that needs to be managed. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Emma and Jake shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Jennifer looked between Marcus and me with an expression of barely concealed anxiety, while Marcus himself seemed to be growing more frustrated by the minute. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, throwing his napkin down on the table. "You're being emotional and irrational instead of listening to reason. This is why we need to make this decision for you." Those words, "make this decision for you," echoed in my mind like a death sentence. When had my son decided that he had the right to make my decisions for me? When had I ceased to be a competent adult in his eyes and become a problem to be solved? "You don't get to make my decisions for me, Marcus," I said, standing up from the table with as much dignity as I could muster. "I am not a child, and you are not my guardian." "Maybe that needs to change," he said quietly, but not so quietly that I couldn't hear him. The words hit me like a slap across the face. My own son, the boy I had carried for 9 months, the child I had rocked to sleep and nursed through countless illnesses, the young man I had put through college and supported through his early career struggles, was suggesting that he should have legal authority over my life. I looked around the table one more time, hoping to see some flicker of support, some sign that someone in my family was willing to stand up for me. But Jennifer avoided my eyes, and even my beloved grandchildren seemed to shrink into their chairs, unwilling or unable to contradict their father. "I think you should leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, don't be dramatic," Marcus said, but he was already standing up, gathering his jacket from the back of his chair. "We're not trying to hurt you, we're trying to help you." "If you want to help me," I replied, "you'll treat me like the intelligent, capable woman who raised you instead of like some kind of burden that needs to be managed." But even as I spoke the words, I could see that my son had already made up his mind. In his eyes, I was no longer Louise Mitchell, the woman who had given him life and love and everything I had to offer. I was simply an elderly person, a statistic, a potential problem that needed to be controlled. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Marcus made one final attempt to assert his authority. "Mom, I'm serious about this driving thing. If you won't listen to reason, we'll have to find other ways to keep you and everyone else safe." "Are you threatening me?" I asked, genuinely shocked by the implication of his words. "I'm protecting you," he said, but there was something cold in his voice that I had never heard before. Something that made me realize that the son I thought I knew might have been an illusion all along. After they left, I sat alone in my dining room, surrounded by the remnants of what was supposed to have been a pleasant family meal. The pot roast had grown cold, the apple pie sat untouched, and the good china seemed to mock me with its delicate beauty, a reminder of traditions and values that apparently meant nothing to the younger generation. I tried to make sense of what had just happened. How had a simple Sunday dinner turned into a battleground? How had my son's concern for my safety transformed into what felt like a hostile takeover of my life? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? As I sat there in the growing darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling around me, I began to understand that this confrontation had been building for longer than I had realized. There had been small signs, subtle changes, in the way Marcus spoke to me, the way he questioned my decisions and second-guessed my choices. He had been testing the waters, seeing how much authority I would allow him to assume over my life. The driving issue wasn't really about driving at all. It was about control. It was about Marcus positioning himself as the decision-maker in my life, the responsible adult who knew what was best for his aging mother. It was about reducing me from a person to a problem, from an individual with rights and dignity to a dependent who should be grateful for whatever scraps of autonomy her family was willing to allow her. But Marcus had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated the woman who had raised him. He had forgotten that the same strength and determination that had carried me through decades of challenges wasn't going to evaporate just because I had reached an arbitrary age that made him uncomfortable. As I finally got up to clear the table and put away the untouched food, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to accept this treatment. I wasn't going to allow my son or anyone else to strip away my independence and dignity without a fight. I had earned the right to make my own decisions, and I was going to defend that right with everything I had. The war between Marcus and me had begun, though he didn't know it yet. He thought he was dealing with a confused, fragile old woman who would eventually see reason and accept his authority. Instead, he was about to discover that he was dealing with Louise Mitchell, a woman who had survived the Great Depression as a child, who had raised a family during the turbulent 60s and 70s, who had built a successful career in an era when women had to fight for every opportunity. I had faced down bigger challenges than an ungrateful son who thought age had made me weak, and I was about to prove to him and to myself that Louise Mitchell was far from finished. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. The hurt and confusion of the previous evening had crystallized into something harder and more focused. I wasn't going to be a victim in this situation. I was going to be a warrior. I made myself a proper breakfast, not the toast and coffee that I had been settling for lately, but eggs and bacon and fresh orange juice, the kind of meal that fuels the body for battle. As I ate, I began to formulate a plan. If Marcus wanted to play games with my independence, then I was going to show him exactly what independence looked like. The first step was to prove to myself, and eventually to him, that I was perfectly capable of driving safely. I called the Department of Motor Vehicles and scheduled an appointment for a complete driving evaluation, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to have official documentation of my competency. I also called a driving instructor and arranged for a refresher course, not because I had forgotten how to drive, but because I wanted to demonstrate my commitment to safety. But even as I made these practical arrangements, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Marcus's behavior than simple concern for my welfare. There had been something calculating in his approach the night before, something that suggested this wasn't a spontaneous expression of worry, but rather a carefully planned campaign. I decided to do some investigating of my own. I started by calling my friend Helen, whose son worked at the same insurance company as Marcus. Helen was 2 years older than me, but sharp as a tack, and she had always been a good judge of character. "Louise, honey, I've been wondering when you were going to call," Helen said when I reached her. "Tom mentioned that Marcus has been asking around about elder care services and legal guardianship procedures. I thought it was odd, given that you're as competent as anyone I know." The blood in my veins turned to ice water. Legal guardianship. Marcus wasn't just thinking about taking away my car keys. He was considering taking away all of my rights, making me legally dependent on him for every decision, every aspect of my life. "Are you sure about this, Helen?" I asked, though I could hear the truth in her voice. Tom was very specific. Marcus told him he was researching options for when his mother started to decline. Tom thought it was responsible planning, but I know you, Louise, and there's nothing declining about you except maybe your tolerance for foolishness. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, processing this new information. My son wasn't just worried about my driving. He was actively planning to take control of my entire life, to reduce me to the status of a legal ward who couldn't make any decisions without his permission. The betrayal cut deeper than I had thought possible. This wasn't a concerned son looking out for his aging mother. This was a calculating man positioning himself to control his mother's assets and decisions, using her age as a convenient excuse for his actions. I thought about all the years I had worked to build a secure retirement for myself. I had been careful with money, investing wisely, saving diligently, making sure that I would never be a burden on my children. I had a comfortable nest egg, a paid-off house, and enough resources to maintain my independence for many years to come. Was that what Marcus was really after? Was he looking at my assets and seeing his inheritance, eager to get his hands on, money that I had worked a lifetime to accumulate? The more I thought about it, the more pieces began to fall into place. Marcus's increasing interest in my finances over the past year, his questions about my investments and my will, his suggestions that I should simplify my banking arrangements by adding him to my accounts, just in case. I had attributed all of this to natural concern, but now I was beginning to see it for what it really was: preparation for a takeover. I spent the rest of that day making phone calls and gathering information. I called my lawyer, my accountant, and my doctor, making appointments to review my legal and financial situation and to get professional assessments of my competency. I wasn't going to give Marcus any ammunition to use against me, and I was going to be prepared for whatever he had planned. By evening, I had a clearer picture of my situation and a plan for how to proceed. I was going to beat Marcus at his own game, but I was going to do it with style, dignity, and a level of strategic thinking that would remind him exactly who had raised him and taught him everything he knew about planning and preparation. The next few days passed quietly, but I could feel the storm building. Marcus called several times, each conversation more pointed than the last. He asked about my grocery shopping, whether I was getting enough exercise, how I was managing my medications. Each question felt like a probe, an attempt to find evidence of decline or incompetence that he could use to justify his plans. I answered every question with patience and detail, demonstrating my clarity of thought and my complete competence in managing my own affairs. But I could hear the frustration in his voice as he failed to find the ammunition he was looking for. The confrontation I had been expecting came the following Sunday. Marcus showed up at my house unannounced without Jennifer and the children, his face set in lines of grim determination. "Mom, we need to finish our conversation from last week," he said as I let him in. "I thought we had finished it," I replied, calmly. "I told you that I'm perfectly capable of driving and managing my own affairs." "That's what we need to talk about," he said, settling into my living room chair as if he owned the place. "I've been thinking about this situation, and I realize that the driving issue is just the tip of the iceberg. I think it's time we discussed a more comprehensive plan for your care." There it was. The word care, delivered with the kind of false concern that made my skin crawl. I sat down across from him, my hands folded in my lap, my expression calm despite the fury building inside me. "What kind of plan did you have in mind?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Well, to start with, I think we should look at assisted living facilities in the area. There are some very nice places that would give you the support you need while still maintaining some independence. Some independence, as if independence were something that could be rationed out in carefully measured portions by a benevolent overseer. I don't need support, Marcus. I need my family to respect me and trust me to know what's best for my own life." "Mom, you're not seeing this clearly. You're 73 years old. You live alone in a big house that's getting harder for you to maintain. You're driving a car that could become dangerous at any moment. And frankly, managing your finances is becoming more complex than someone your age should have to deal with. My finances are perfectly managed, thank you very much. I've been handling money longer than you've been alive, and I'm quite capable of continuing to do so. That's another thing we need to discuss. Marcus said, and I heard the steel enter his voice. I think it would be wise to simplify your banking arrangements. Maybe set up a joint account so I can help you with bills and investments. And there it was, the real reason for this entire campaign. Marcus wanted access to my money, my accounts, my carefully accumulated assets. He wanted to position himself as my financial guardian, with all the control and access that would entail. I see, I said quietly. And I suppose you've already researched the legal procedures for making that happen? Marcus had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but he didn't deny it. I've looked into some options, yes. It's called planning. Ahead, Mom. It's what responsible adults do. Responsible adults, I repeated. Like the responsible adult who wants to put his competent mother into assisted living and take control of her finances. I'm trying to help you, Marcus said, but his voice was rising now, and I could see the mask of concern beginning to slip. You're being stubborn and unreasonable, and frankly, it's starting to make me wonder if you're really as competent as you think you are. It was a masterful piece of manipulation. By questioning my competence, he was trying to make me doubt myself, to make me wonder if perhaps he was right, and I really was losing my ability to manage my own life. It was the kind of psychological warfare that could break down a person's confidence and make them grateful to have someone else take over the burden of decision-making. But Marcus had forgotten something important about his mother. He had forgotten that I had been fighting battles and solving problems since before he was born. He had forgotten that the woman who had raised him wasn't weak or easily manipulated. And most importantly, he had forgotten that I loved him enough to see through his lies, but not enough to let him destroy me. Marcus, I said, standing up with all the dignity I could muster, I want you to leave my house. I want you to stop calling me with your fake concerns and your manipulative questions. And I want you to understand that I am not going to allow you or anyone else to take away my independence, my home, my car, or my money. You can't stop me, he said. And for just a moment, the mask fell away completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. If I have to go to court to protect you from yourself, I will. Then I guess we'll see each other in court, I replied. But I promise you this, Marcus. You're going to find out that your mother is a lot stronger and a lot smarter than you've given her credit for. As he left, slamming the door behind him, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The pretense was over. The gloves were off. Marcus had declared war on my independence, and I was ready to fight back with everything I had. But first, I was going to do something that would send him a message he would never forget. I was going to prove to him, and to myself, that Louise Mitchell was nobody's victim. I was going to take back control of this situation in the most direct way possible. I was going to drive to the bank, and I was going to show my son exactly what happened when he underestimated the woman who had given him life. The morning after Marcus's ultimatum, I woke with a clarity that surprised me. The fog of hurt and confusion had lifted, replaced by something sharper and more focused. I had spent most of the night sitting in my late husband Walter's study, surrounded by the financial records and documents that told the story of our life together. 47 years of marriage, 32 years of widowhood, and decades of careful planning had built something substantial, something worth protecting. Walter had been gone for 15 years now, but his voice still echoed in my mind during moments like these. Louise, he used to say, never let anyone make you feel small, especially not someone who should know better. He would have been furious at Marcus's behavior, would have seen through the manipulation immediately. Walter had been the one to teach me about investments, about financial independence, about the importance of maintaining control over your own destiny. I pulled out the file folders that contained the evidence of everything Marcus had conveniently forgotten. The college tuition payments that had totaled nearly $60,000. The wedding expenses that had cost us our planned European vacation. The down payment on his first house that had come from our retirement savings. The business loan we had co-signed when his insurance agency was struggling in its early years. The gifts, the emergencies, the constant financial safety. net that Walter and I had provided without question or complaint. But it wasn't just the money, though the amounts were staggering when I added them up. It was the time, the emotional investment, the decades of putting his needs before our own. When Marcus was struggling with his marriage, I had listened to hours of complaints about Jennifer. When he was having problems at work, I had offered advice and encouragement. When the children were sick, I had dropped everything to help with babysitting and household duties. I had been the perfect mother, the kind who never said no, never questioned the constant requests for help, never suggested that perhaps a 42-year-old man should be handling his own problems. And this was how that devotion was being repaid, with condescension, manipulation, and a systematic plan to strip away everything that made me who I am. The phone rang at exactly 8:30, interrupting my bitter reflections. It was Margaret, from the church auxiliary, calling about the upcoming charity drive. As we chatted about donation logistics and volunteer schedules, I found myself studying my own voice, listening for any signs of the decline that Marcus claimed to see. My words were clear, my thoughts organized, my memory sharp as ever. I was discussing complex scheduling issues, remembering names and dates, coordinating multiple moving parts with the same efficiency I had always possessed. After the call ended, I sat staring at the phone with growing anger. There was nothing wrong with my mind, nothing wrong with my judgment, nothing wrong with my ability to manage my own life. Marcus's concerns weren't based on reality. They were based on his own agenda, his own desire to control and manipulate. I spent the rest of the morning making a series of phone calls that would have impressed any business executive. I spoke with my investment advisor, reviewing my portfolio and discussing recent market changes. I called my insurance agent to review my policies and make sure my beneficiaries were still current. I contacted my lawyer to schedule an appointment, to review my will and discuss estate planning options. Each conversation reinforced what I already knew. I was completely competent, fully aware of my financial situation, and perfectly capable of making informed decisions about my future. The investment advisor complimented me on my conservative approach and excellent long-term planning. The insurance agent noted that I was one of his most organized clients. The lawyer commented on how refreshing it was to work with someone who had all their documents in order and understood the implications of their choices. By noon, I had accomplished more in 4 hours than Marcus probably accomplished in a week, and I had done it all while supposedly being too old and incompetent to manage my own affairs. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a woman who Marcus claimed needed to be protected from herself, successfully managing complex financial and legal matters while he was probably sitting in his office adjusting insurance claims and counting down the hours until 5 o'clock. I decided to pay a visit to someone who might have additional insights into my son's recent behavior. Dorothy Henderson lived 3 houses down from me and had been my neighbor for over 20 years. She was also Jennifer's aunt, a relationship that had given me occasional glimpses into the dynamics of Marcus's household that I might not have gotten otherwise. Dorothy was in her garden when I walked over, tending to the roses that were her pride and joy. At 78, she moved, with the careful deliberation of someone who understood their physical limitations but refused to be defined by them. She looked up as I approached, her weathered face creasing into a smile. "Louise, how lovely to see you. I was just thinking about you yesterday when Jennifer stopped by." "Oh? What did she have to say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Dorothy straightened up, pulling off her gardening gloves with slow precision. "Well, she seemed quite concerned about you. Kept asking whether I'd noticed any changes in your behavior, whether you seemed confused or forgetful. Honestly, I told her she was being ridiculous. You're sharper than most people half your age." My heart sank. So Jennifer was part of the campaign too, gathering intelligence from neighbors, building a case for Marcus's eventual legal action. The betrayal felt even deeper knowing that my daughter-in-law, whom I had welcomed into the family with open arms, was actively working against me. Did she say why she was asking? Dorothy's expression grew troubled. She mentioned something about driving concerns, said Marcus was worried about your safety. But between you and me, Louise, I think there's more to it than that. Jennifer seemed awfully interested in your house, kept commenting on how big it is, how much work it must be to maintain. Asked a lot of questions about property values in the neighborhood. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. It wasn't just about control. It wasn't just about the money in my bank accounts. They were looking at my entire estate, evaluating my assets like vultures circling a dying animal. The house that Walter and I had bought as newlyweds, the home, where we had raised Marcus and built our life together, was being appraised by my own family as if I were already gone. Dorothy, did Jennifer say anything else? Anything about assisted living or legal arrangements? The older woman's eyes sharpened with concern. She did mention something about researching senior communities. Said she and Marcus were trying to be proactive about planning for your future needs. I thought it was premature, honestly. You're in better shape than I am, and I'm certainly not ready for assisted living. I thanked Dorothy and walked back to my house with my mind racing. The conspiracy was broader than I had imagined. Marcus and Jennifer weren't just planning to take control of my life. They were planning to take control of everything I owned, everything Walter and I had worked for, everything that represented our legacy. Back in my kitchen, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to think strategically. If Marcus wanted to play games, I was going to show him how the game was really played. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I called Helen again, this time asking her to find out more specific information about Marcus's inquiries. Helen's son Tom had mentioned legal guardianship, but I needed details. What exactly had Marcus been asking about? How far along was he in the process? Did he have a timeline for his plans? Helen called back within 2 hours with information that made my blood run cold. According to Tom, Marcus had been very specific in his inquiries. He had asked about the process for declaring someone mentally incompetent. He had researched the requirements for emergency guardianship. He had inquired about how quickly assets could be protected once guardianship was established. Louise, honey, Helen said, her voice tight with concern. Tom said Marcus seemed to know an awful lot about the process already, like he'd been researching it for some time. And he asked very pointed questions about how to document someone's declining mental state. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just planning to take control of my life sometime in the future. He was actively building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent, possibly in the very near term. Every phone call, every visit, every conversation we'd had recently had been an opportunity for him to gather evidence of supposed decline. I thought back to our recent interactions with new understanding. The way he had questioned my memory about family events. The concerned looks when I couldn't immediately remember a neighbor's name. The subtle challenges to my recollection of conversations and plans. He hadn't been making conversation. He had been testing me, looking for ammunition to use against me. The driving issue had never been about safety. It had been the opening gambit in a larger campaign to establish that I was no longer competent to make my own decisions. Once he could convince a court that I was too dangerous to drive, it would be a short step to arguing that I was too incompetent to manage my finances, my living situation, my medical care. I felt sick thinking about how carefully orchestrated everything had been. The timing of his concerns, the involvement of Jennifer and the children, the systematic gathering of information from neighbors and friends. This wasn't the impulsive worry of a loving son. This was a calculated campaign designed to strip away my rights and my dignity. But Marcus had made one crucial error in his planning. He had underestimated me. He had assumed that because I was 73 years old, I would be easy to manipulate, easy to confuse, easy to defeat. He had forgotten that the woman who had raised him was the same woman who had survived the death of her husband, who had managed the complex transition from married life to widowhood, who had successfully navigated decades of financial planning and estate management. He had forgotten that Louise Mitchell had never been anyone's victim. That evening, I sat down at my dining room table with a legal pad and began to plan my counterattack. If Marcus wanted to play the game of documentation and evidence, I was going to show him how it was really done. But unlike his campaign of deception and manipulation, mine was going to be based on truth, facts, and irrefutable proof of my competence. The first step was to establish a comprehensive record of my mental and physical capabilities. I scheduled appointments with my primary care physician, a neurologist, and a psychiatrist. I wanted complete medical evaluations that would provide professional documentation of my cognitive abilities. I also arranged for comprehensive driving evaluations with both the Department of Motor Vehicles and a private driving instructor who specialized in senior driver assessments. The second step was to secure my assets. I couldn't prevent Marcus from eventually filing legal papers, but I could make sure that my money and property were protected until any court proceedings were resolved. I scheduled meetings with my banker, my investment advisor, and my attorney to discuss strategies for safeguarding my estate. The third step was to document everything. Every phone call from Marcus, every visit, every conversation would be recorded in a detailed journal with dates, times, and exact quotes. If he wanted to build a case based on supposed evidence of decline, I was going to build a case based on actual evidence of his manipulation and deception. But perhaps most importantly, I was going to send Marcus a message that would make it crystal clear that his mother was not the helpless victim he had assumed I would be. The next morning, I got dressed with particular care. I chose a navy blue suit that Walter had always said brought out my eyes, paired with pearls that had been my mother's, and shoes that were both elegant and practical. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a competent, dignified woman who was perfectly capable of managing her own affairs. I drove to the bank where Walter and I had done business for over 30 years, the same bank where we had gotten our first mortgage, where we had saved for Marcus's college education, where we had carefully built the financial security that was supposed to ensure our independence in our golden years. Patricia Williams, the branch manager, greeted me with the warm familiarity of someone who had known me for decades. She had started as a teller when she was barely out of high school, and I had watched her work her way up through the ranks with determination and intelligence that reminded me of my younger self. "Mrs. Mitchell, how wonderful to see you. How can I help you today?" "Patricia, I need to make some changes to my accounts, particularly the joint checking account I share with my son." Patricia's expression grew more serious as she led me to her office. She had handled enough family financial drama over the years to recognize the signs of trouble brewing. As I explained the situation, I watched Patricia's face carefully. She knew Marcus, had processed many of the transactions that had transferred money from my accounts to his over the years. She had seen the pattern of financial dependence that had characterized our relationship. But she also knew me, had witnessed my careful management of complex financial decisions, had processed the investment strategies that had grown my nest egg year after year. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said carefully, "I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. You want to remove Marcus from the joint checking account and establish new account arrangements that give you sole control over your finances? That's exactly what I want. And Patricia, I want to do it today. I have reason to believe that Marcus may attempt to access these accounts inappropriately, and I want to protect my assets before that can happen." Patricia nodded slowly. She had seen similar situations before, knew the signs of financial elder abuse even when it came from family members. "We can absolutely make those changes. But Mrs. Mitchell, I have to ask, is Marcus aware that you're taking these steps?" "He will be," I said grimly, "very soon." The process took nearly 2 hours. We closed the joint account and opened new accounts in my name only. We established new security protocols and passwords. We set up alerts that would notify me immediately of any attempts to access my accounts or any unusual activity. Patricia also gave me information about additional protections that were available for senior customers, including special monitoring services and fraud prevention measures. As we completed the paperwork, Patricia looked at me with something that might have been admiration. "Mrs. Mitchell, if you don't mind me saying so, you're handling this very well. A lot of people in your situation might feel overwhelmed or confused by all these financial details. Patricia, I've been managing money since before you were born. Just because I'm 73 doesn't mean I've forgotten how to protect myself." When I left the bank, I felt a sense of empowerment that I hadn't experienced in months. For too long, I had allowed Marcus to make me feel uncertain about my own capabilities, to plant seeds of doubt about my judgment and competence. But sitting in that bank, making complex financial decisions with complete clarity and confidence, I had reminded myself who I really was. I was Louise Mitchell. I was nobody's fool, and I was certainly nobody's victim. But I wasn't done yet. The financial protection was just the beginning. Now it was time to send Marcus a message that would make it perfectly clear that his campaign of manipulation had not only failed, but had backfired spectacularly. I drove to the shopping center where Marcus worked, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind focused on the confrontation ahead. I had spent enough time being defensive, trying to prove my competence to someone who had already decided I was incompetent. Now it was time to go on the offense. The insurance office where Marcus worked was located in a generic strip mall between a nail salon and a sandwich shop. I had been there many times over the years, celebrating his promotion to manager, bringing lunch when he was working late, playing the proud mother to his colleagues and clients. Today, I was there for a very different purpose. Marcus's secretary, a young woman named Ashley, who had always been polite and respectful, looked surprised to see me. "Mrs. Mitchell, how nice to see you. Are you here to see Marcus? I think he's with a client, but I can check if he's available. Please tell him I'm here. Tell him it's urgent." Ashley knocked on Marcus's office door and spoke in low tones before returning to her desk. "He'll be right with you, Mrs. Mitchell. Can I get you some coffee or water while you wait?" I declined the offer and stood looking at the motivational posters on the office walls. Success is a journey, not a destination. The difference between ordinary and extraordinary is that little extra. Your attitude determines your altitude. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here was my son, surrounded by messages about success and achievement, trying to destroy the woman who had made his success possible. Marcus emerged from his office with his professional smile firmly in place, but I could see the wariness in his eyes. He knew something was wrong, could sense the change in the dynamic between us. "Mom, this is a surprise. What brings you by the office?" "We need to talk, Marcus, privately." He led me into his office and closed the door, his expression growing more concerned by the moment. The office was exactly what I would have expected. Neat, organized, filled with family photos and professional awards. The successful insurance, sure, the responsible family man, the devoted son. All lies, as it turned out. "Marcus, I know what you've been doing." He tried to maintain his innocent expression, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mom. I know about your research into legal guardianship. I know about Jennifer questioning the neighbors. I know about your plans to have me declared mentally incompetent so you can take control of my assets." The mask finally slipped completely. Marcus sat back in his chair, his professional demeanor replaced by something colder and more calculating. "Mom, if you know all that, then you also know that I'm only trying to protect you." "Protect me from what, Marcus? From living my own life? From making my own decisions? From maintaining control over the money I worked my entire life to accumulate?" From making mistakes that could hurt you or other people? Mom, you're 73 years old. Whether you want to admit it or not, you're getting older, and older people make errors in judgment. I'm trying to prevent problems before they happen. The only problem here is a son who thinks he can steal his mother's independence and call it love. Marcus's expression hardened. I'm not stealing anything. I'm accepting responsibility for a situation that you're apparently unwilling to acknowledge. And frankly, Mom, the fact that you're here, making accusations and getting emotional, just proves my point about your declining judgment. It was masterfully done. Even in the face of being caught in his deception, Marcus was trying to turn my legitimate anger into evidence of incompetence. Every word I spoke in my own defense would be twisted into proof that I was becoming irrational and unstable. But I had come prepared for exactly this response. Marcus, I want you to listen to me very carefully. This morning, I went to the bank and removed you from all of my accounts. I have closed our joint checking account and established new accounts in my name only. You no longer have any access to my money. The color drained from his face. You can't do that. I can, and I have. I am a competent adult with full legal rights to control my own finances. And before you start planning your next move, you should know that I have scheduled comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations to document my mental state. I have arranged for professional driving assessments to prove my competence behind the wheel. And I have consulted with an attorney about protecting myself from financial exploitation, even when that exploitation comes from family members. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling to process this unexpected turn of events. He had been so confident in his ability to manipulate and control me that he hadn't prepared for the possibility that I might fight back. Mom, you're making a mistake. You're going to need help managing your finances, and I'm the logical person to provide that help. If you cut me out now, you'll just have to deal with strangers who don't care about you the way I do. Marcus, you don't care about me at all. You care about my money and my property. You care about positioning yourself to inherit everything I own. But you don't care about me as a person, or you never would have treated me the way you have. That's not true, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing without an agenda? When was the last time you visited without making comments about my driving or my house or my ability to manage my affairs? When was the last time you treated me like your mother instead of like a problem to be solved? Marcus had no answer. For that, because we both knew the truth. Our relationship had become entirely transactional, with him constantly probing for weaknesses he could exploit, and me constantly trying to prove my continued competence. This doesn't have to be a war, Mom. We can work together to make sure you're safe and comfortable. On your terms, you mean? With you in control and me grateful for whatever scraps of independence you're willing to allow me. I'm trying. To protect you. No, Marcus, you're trying to control me. There's a difference, though apparently you're too selfish to see it. I stood up, gathering my purse and preparing to leave. I had said what I came to say, had delivered the message I wanted him to receive. The balance of power in our relationship had shifted, and I wanted to make sure he understood the new dynamics. Mom, wait. You're upset and you're not thinking clearly. Let's talk about this rationally. I am thinking clearly, Marcus. More clearly than I have in months. And what I'm thinking is that you are not the son I raised, and I am not the helpless old woman you seem to think I've become. As I walked toward the door, Marcus made one final attempt to assert his authority. Mom, if you go through with this, if you cut me out of your finances and refuse to accept help, I'll have no choice but to pursue legal guardianship. I have documentation of your declining mental state, and I have witnesses who will testify about your increasingly erratic behavior. I turned back to face him, and for the first time in this entire confrontation, I smiled. Marcus, you have documentation of nothing except your own delusions. You have witnesses who will testify to nothing except your campaign of manipulation. And if you want to go to court, We'll go to court, but I promise you this. It won't end the way you think it will. I left him sitting in his office, staring after me with an expression of shock and growing concern. The son who had thought he was dealing with a confused, fragile old woman had just discovered that he was dealing with Louise Mitchell in full battle mode. And Louise Mitchell had never lost a fight that mattered. As I drove home, I felt a fierce satisfaction that I hadn't experienced in years. The war wasn't over, but I had won the first major battle. Marcus knew now that I wasn't going to be an easy victim, that his plans for taking control of my life weren't going to unfold according to his timeline. But more importantly, I had rediscovered something about myself that I had temporarily lost. I had remembered that I was strong, that I was smart, and that I was perfectly capable of defending myself against anyone who tried to take advantage of me, even if that person happened to be my own son. The real fight was just beginning. The drive home from Marcus's office felt different than any drive I had taken in months. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, my vision clear, my reflexes sharp as I navigated through the afternoon traffic with complete confidence. Every turn signal, every lane change, every stop at a red light was executed with the precision of someone who had been driving safely for over 50 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was demonstrating the very competence Marcus claimed I lacked, using the very skill he insisted I had lost. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat for a moment in the quiet sanctuary of my car, allowing myself to absorb what had just happened. I had confronted my son with the truth about his deception, had taken concrete steps to protect my assets, and had made it clear that I wasn't going to be the passive victim he had expected me to be. It felt like waking up from a long, confusing dream and discovering that reality was both clearer and more manageable than the nightmare I had been living in. But I also knew that Marcus wasn't going to accept this defeat quietly. He had invested too much time and energy in his campaign to control my life to simply walk away because I had outmaneuvered him in the first round. If anything, my resistance would probably make him more determined, more creative in his efforts to achieve his goals. I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Inside my house, I went straight to Walter's study and pulled out a fresh legal pad. If I was going to wage this war effectively, I needed to approach it with the same methodical planning that had served me well in every other challenge I had faced over the past 7 decades. I began by making a comprehensive list of every asset Marcus might try to target, every vulnerability he might attempt to exploit, every legal avenue he might pursue in his quest to gain control over my life. The house was the most obvious target. Walter and I had bought it in 1978 for $38,000, a stretch at the time, but an investment that had paid off beyond our wildest dreams. Current market values put it at close to $400,000, a substantial asset that represented not just financial security, but decades of memories, improvements, and emotional investment. Marcus had been making increasingly pointed comments about the burden of maintaining such a large property, the expense of upkeep, the wisdom of downsizing. Now I understood that those comments hadn't been expressions of concern, but rather preliminary arguments for why I should be forced to sell. My investment portfolio was more complex and therefore more vulnerable to claims of mismanagement. Walter had been conservative in his approach to investing, preferring blue-chip stocks and government bonds to more speculative ventures. After his death, I had worked with a financial advisor to diversify the portfolio while maintaining the conservative approach that had served us well. The result was a substantial nest egg that provided comfortable retirement income while preserving capital for the future. Marcus knew the approximate value of these investments and had been pressing me to simplify my holdings, arguing that managing such a complex portfolio was becoming too difficult for someone my age. Then there were the more personal assets that carried emotional value far beyond their monetary worth. Walter's collection of antique pocket watches passed down through 3 generations of his family. My mother's china and silver, pieces that had graced holiday tables for decades, family photographs, letters, documents that told the story of our lives together. Marcus wouldn't hesitate to liquidate these items if he gained control, dismissing them as clutter that needed to be cleared out to make my life more manageable. As I worked through this inventory, I began to see the full scope of what Marcus was trying to accomplish. This wasn't just about gaining access to my money or forcing me into assisted living. This was about erasing Louise Mitchell entirely, reducing me to a ward of the state, whose existence could be managed by professionals while her assets were redistributed according to her son's preferences. The phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. It was Dr. Richardson's office, calling to confirm my appointment for the comprehensive medical evaluation I had scheduled. The receptionist was friendly and efficient, explaining what the examination would entail and what documentation I should bring. As I spoke with her, I realized that I was conducting a perfectly normal, complex conversation about medical procedures and insurance requirements without any confusion or difficulty. My memory was clear, my understanding complete, my ability to ask relevant questions unimpaired. After the call ended, I found myself wondering how many other 73-year-old people could manage the kind of detailed planning and strategic thinking I had been engaged in over the past few days. How many could navigate complex financial transactions, schedule multiple professional appointments, conduct thorough research into legal protections, and simultaneously manage the emotional trauma of family betrayal? The answer, I suspected, was not very many. Yet Marcus persisted in treating me as if age alone had rendered me incompetent. The afternoon mail brought an unexpected surprise that momentarily lifted my spirits. A letter from Emma, my granddaughter, written in the careful cursive that schools no longer seemed to teach. She was working on a school project about family history and wanted to interview me about what life was like when I was her age. The letter was full of thoughtful questions about my childhood, my education, my early married life with her grandfather. Reading her words, I was struck by the maturity of her thinking and the genuine curiosity she expressed about my experiences. But the letter also reminded me of what was at stake in this battle with Marcus. Emma and Jake had grown up knowing me as a strong, independent grandmother who was actively involved in their lives. They had never seen me as helpless or incompetent. They valued my stories, my advice, my presence at their important events. If Marcus succeeded in his plans, they would be taught to see me as a burden, a problem, someone whose declining abilities required professional management. They would lose not just their grandmother, but their understanding of what it meant to age with dignity and strength. I decided to call Emma that evening, ostensibly to discuss her school project, but really to gauge whether Marcus had begun poisoning the children against me. The conversation was everything I had hoped it would be. Emma was excited about the assignment, full of questions about my job as a secretary in the 1970s, fascinated by stories about life before computers and cell phones. She spoke about me with obvious respect and affection, showing no signs of having been told that her grandmother was becoming senile or dangerous. "Grandma," she said toward the end of our conversation, "Mom mentioned that Dad is worried about your driving. Is everything okay?" The question caught me off guard, and I realized that Marcus and Jennifer were being more subtle with the children than I had expected. Rather than telling them outright that I was incompetent, they were planting seeds of concern, preparing them for future revelations about my supposed decline. "Everything is fine, sweetheart," I assured her. "Your father is just being overprotective. You know how parents worry sometimes, even when there's no real reason for concern." "That's what I thought," Emma said with obvious relief. "You seem exactly the same to me as you always have, maybe even sharper, actually. Mom says that happens sometimes with older people, that they have good days and bad days." The manipulation was more sophisticated than I had given Jennifer credit for. By suggesting that I had good days and bad days, she was creating a framework that would allow them to explain away any evidence of my competence as temporary fluctuations in an overall pattern of decline. It was insidious and effective, designed to undermine confidence in my abilities, even when those abilities were clearly demonstrated. After I hung up the phone, I felt a new urgency about documenting my competence in ways that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The medical and psychological evaluations I had scheduled would provide professional opinions, but I needed something more comprehensive, something that would demonstrate sustained cognitive ability over time. I spent the evening writing a detailed memoir of the past year, documenting every major decision I had made, every problem I had solved, every challenge I had navigated successfully. The roof repair that I had researched, contracted, and supervised without help from anyone. The investment strategy review that had resulted in improved returns on my portfolio. The complex insurance claim I had managed after a tree fell on my garage during a storm. The coordination of medical care for Dorothy when she had hip surgery, including arranging transportation, meal delivery, and temporary housekeeping services. As the list grew longer, I realized that not only was I managing my own life with complete competence, I was actively helping other people manage theirs. Far from being a burden who needed care, I was a resource that my community relied on for wisdom, practical assistance, and emotional support. The next morning brought another phone call from Marcus, his tone carefully modulated to suggest reasonable concern rather than the anger I knew he was feeling. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realize I may have come across as more confrontational than I intended. I'm genuinely worried about you, and I want to make sure we can work together to address my concerns." The false sincerity in his voice was almost more insulting than his previous honesty had been. At least when he was being openly manipulative, I knew where I stood. This pretense of care and cooperation was designed to make me doubt my own perceptions, to wonder if perhaps I had been too harsh in my judgment of his motives. "What exactly did you want to work together on, Marcus?" "Well, I think we should start with a comprehensive evaluation of your current situation. Not because I think you're incompetent," he added quickly, "but because I want to understand your needs and preferences so I can be more helpful." "What kind of evaluation did you have in mind?" "I've been researching geriatric care specialists who conduct thorough assessments of older adults' living situations, financial management capabilities, healthcare needs, that sort of thing. It would give us objective information to work with instead of just arguing about perceptions and opinions." The suggestion sounded reasonable on the surface, which made it even more dangerous. Marcus had clearly done his homework and found professionals who could provide the kind of documentation he needed to support his guardianship petition. These assessments would be conducted by people who didn't know me, who would be looking for signs of decline rather than evidence of competence, who would approach me as a potential problem rather than as a functioning adult. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of evaluating my own situation. In fact, I've already scheduled comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations with professionals I trust." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Marcus recalculating his approach. "That's great, Mom, but I think it would be helpful to have evaluations from specialists who focus specifically on aging issues. The doctors you've chosen are excellent for general care, but they may not have the expertise to identify subtle changes that could indicate future problems." "Future problems that don't currently exist, you mean?" "Problems that we could prevent or plan for if we identified them early enough." It was masterfully done. Marcus was positioning himself as the responsible son who wanted to prevent problems, rather than the manipulative opportunist who was creating them. He was suggesting that professional evaluations were a collaborative tool rather than ammunition for a legal battle. And he was implying that my chosen professionals were somehow inadequate, less qualified than the specialists he had researched. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. I am not going to submit to evaluations by people whose purpose is to find problems with my competence. I am not going to cooperate with any plan that starts from the assumption that I need someone else to manage my life. And I am not going to pretend that your sudden concern for my welfare is anything other than a transparent attempt to gain control over my assets." "Mom, that's not fair. I've been concerned about you for months, and you've refused to listen to any of my suggestions or take any of my advice seriously." "Your advice about what, Marcus? About giving up my independence? About turning over my financial decisions to you? About moving into assisted living so you can sell my house? None of that advice was for my benefit, and we both know it. You're being paranoid and unreasonable. The fact that you're interpreting my concern as some kind of conspiracy is exactly the kind of thinking that worries me about your mental state." Again, he was turning my legitimate suspicions into evidence of mental decline. Every time I accurately identified his manipulation, he used my accuracy as proof that I was becoming delusional. It was a closed loop designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and judgments. "Marcus, this conversation is over. Don't call me again unless you're prepared to treat me with the respect I deserve as your mother and as a competent adult." I hung up the phone before he could respond, but I knew the conversation had accomplished exactly what Marcus had intended. He had created a record of my unreasonable behavior, my paranoid accusations, my refusal to accept help. In his inevitable court filing, this conversation would be cited as evidence of my declining mental state and my need for professional intervention. But I had accomplished something too. I had made it clear that I understood his game and wasn't going to play by his rules. I had established that I was prepared to fight, that I had resources and determination he hadn't anticipated, and I had bought myself time to continue building my own case while he struggled to adapt to this unexpected resistance. The rest of the week passed in a blur of appointments and preparations. The medical evaluation with Dr. Richardson was thorough and reassuring. He conducted cognitive tests, memory assessments, and physical examinations that confirmed what I already knew. I was in excellent health for my age, with no signs of dementia, cognitive decline, or physical impairment that would affect my ability to live independently. The psychological evaluation was more intensive, but equally positive. Dr. Martinez, a specialist in geriatric psychology, spent 3 hours with me conducting various tests and interviews designed to assess my mental state, decision-making abilities, and emotional stability. She was impressed by my clarity of thought, my appropriate emotional responses to stress, and my realistic assessment of my own capabilities and limitations. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said as we concluded our final session, "I want you to know that, in 30 years of practice, I have rarely seen someone your age with such clear cognitive function and emotional resilience. Whatever concerns your family may have expressed, they are not supported by any objective evidence of decline." The driving evaluations were equally successful. The DMV examiner noted that my vision, reflexes, and judgment were all well within normal ranges for any age group. The private instructor I worked with for a comprehensive refresher course commented that I was more careful and attentive than most drivers half my age. But perhaps the most valuable preparation I made during this time was legal. My attorney, Robert Chen, had been handling my affairs since Walter's death, and he knew both my capabilities and my family situation well. When I explained what Marcus was planning, his expression grew grave. "Louise, what you're describing sounds like a classic case of attempted financial exploitation by a family member. Unfortunately, it's more common than most people realize, and the legal system doesn't always provide adequate protection for competent seniors who are targeted by their own children. What are my options?" "Several. First, we can prepare comprehensive documentation of your competence, including all the medical and psychological evaluations you've arranged. Second, we can establish additional legal protections for your assets, including trusts and other instruments that would be difficult for Marcus to challenge. Third, we can prepare a preemptive legal response to any guardianship petition he might file." What would a preemptive response look like? Essentially, we would file papers with the court establishing your competence and your desire to remain independent. We would include all the professional evaluations, evidence of your successful management of complex affairs, and documentation of Marcus's attempts to manipulate the situation. If he subsequently files for guardianship, the court would have a complete picture of the situation rather than just his side of the story. The process of preparing these legal documents was both empowering and exhausting. I had to review and organize decades of financial records, medical history, and personal documents. I had to write detailed statements explaining my decision-making, processes, my future plans, and my reasons for believing that Marcus's concerns were unfounded. I had to confront the possibility that I might end up in court, defending my right to control my own life against the son I had raised and loved. But as difficult as the process was, it also reinforced my confidence in my own abilities. Every document I organized, every statement I wrote, every legal concept I understood demonstrated that Louise Mitchell was far from the declining senior that Marcus wanted the world to believe she had become. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when Robert called with news that changed everything. "Louise, I've been doing some research into Marcus's background, and I've discovered some information that you need to know about." "What kind of information?" "Financial information. It appears that Marcus's insurance agency is in serious trouble. He's facing significant debt, potential bankruptcy, and possible legal action from creditors. His personal finances are apparently in shambles as well." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just trying to control my life out of misguided concern or even simple greed. He was desperate. His business was failing. His personal finances were collapsing. And he saw my assets as his salvation. "How did you find this out?" "Public records mostly. Business filings, court documents, financial disclosures that are available to anyone who knows where to look. It's all perfectly legal research, and it paints a very clear picture of someone who needs money urgently." Suddenly, everything made sense. The timing of Marcus's concerns about my competence, the urgency of his push for guardianship, the involvement of Jennifer in gathering information from neighbors. They weren't planning for some distant future when I might need care. They were trying to gain immediate access to my assets to solve their current financial crisis. "Robert, if Marcus gains guardianship, would he be able to access my investments?" "Immediately?" "Unfortunately, yes. As your legal guardian, he would have broad authority to make financial decisions on your behalf, including liquidating investments, selling property, and redirecting income. The court oversight is supposed to prevent abuse, but in practice, guardians often have considerable latitude in how they manage their ward's assets." The enormity of what Marcus was attempting began to sink in. He wasn't just trying to control my life. He was trying to steal my life savings to pay his debts. The woman who had sacrificed to put him through college, who had co-signed loans for his business, who had provided financial support whenever he needed it, was now being targeted as a source of funds to solve problems he had created through his own poor decisions. But knowing Marcus's true motivation also gave me a powerful weapon. A court would be much less sympathetic to a guardianship petition filed by someone with urgent financial motives than to one filed by a genuinely concerned son. The question was how to use this information most effectively. "Robert, can we include evidence of Marcus's financial situation in our preemptive filing?" "Absolutely. Financial motivation is highly relevant to any guardianship proceeding. A judge would want to know if the petitioner has ulterior motives for seeking control over the proposed ward's assets." We spent the rest of the afternoon planning our legal strategy. The preemptive filing would include not only evidence of my competence, but also documentation of Marcus's financial desperation and his pattern of manipulation. We would paint a picture of a competent senior being targeted by a financially desperate family member who was using false claims of concern to justify an attempted theft of her assets. As I drove home that evening, I felt a grim satisfaction. Marcus had been so focused on building a case against my competence that he had failed to protect himself against exposure of his true motives. He had assumed that I would be too trusting, too confused, or too intimidated to fight back effectively. He had underestimated the woman who had raised him, and that underestimation was going to cost him dearly. But I also felt a deep sadness that threatened to overwhelm my anger. The son I had loved unconditionally, the child I had sacrificed for without question, the young man I had been so proud to launch into the world, had become someone I barely recognized. The boy who had once brought me flowers picked from the neighbor's garden had grown into a man who was willing to destroy his mother's independence to solve his own problems. That night, I sat in Walter's study and wrote a long letter that I would never send. It was addressed to the Marcus I had raised, the son who had existed before desperation and greed had corrupted his judgment. I wrote about the dreams I had for him, the pride I had felt in his accomplishments, the love that had motivated every sacrifice I had made on his behalf. I wrote about the man I had hoped he would become, and the disappointment I felt in the man he had actually become. When I finished the letter, I folded it carefully and placed it in the file that contained all the other documents related to this battle. Someday, perhaps, Marcus would understand what he had thrown away in his quest for easy money. Someday, he might realize that he had sacrificed a relationship with a mother who loved him for access to assets that could never replace what he had lost. But that day was still in the future. For now, I had a war to win and an independence to defend. Marcus had chosen to see me as a vulnerable target. I was going to show him that he had picked the wrong adversary. The real confrontation was about to begin, and I intended to be ready for it. The storm I had been anticipating finally broke on a cold Monday morning in November. I was in my kitchen, enjoying my usual breakfast of oatmeal and fresh berries, while reading the newspaper, when the doorbell rang with an insistence that immediately put me on alert. It was barely 8 o'clock, far too early for social calls or routine deliveries. Through the front window, I could see a man in a dark suit standing on my porch, holding what appeared to be official documents. My heart began to race, but my mind remained clear. This was it. Marcus had finally made his move, and I was about to face the confrontation I had been preparing for. I took a moment to compose myself, smoothing my hair and straightening my sweater before opening the door with all the dignity I could muster. "Mrs. Louise Mitchell?" the man asked, consulting his paperwork. "Yes, I am Louise Mitchell." "Ma'am, I'm Officer Bradley with the County Sheriff's Department. I have legal documents here that I'm required to serve to you personally." He held out an official-looking envelope with my name typed across the front. I accepted the papers with hands that trembled only slightly, thanking him politely before closing the door and returning to my kitchen. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, weighted with implications that would change my life regardless of how this battle ultimately ended. I sat down at my kitchen table, pushed aside my breakfast dishes, and carefully opened the seal. The documents inside were exactly what I had expected, yet seeing the formal legal language still felt like a physical blow. Petition for emergency. Guardianship and conservatorship was printed across the top of the first page in bold black letters. Below that, in smaller but equally ominous text, was my name listed as the alleged incapacitated person, and Marcus's name as the petitioner. As I read through the petition, I felt my anger building with each paragraph. Marcus had painted a picture of a confused, declining woman who posed a danger to herself and others. He claimed that I had become forgetful and disoriented, that I had made concerning financial decisions, that I had become hostile and paranoid when family members tried to help me. He alleged that my driving had become erratic and dangerous, that I was no longer capable of managing my medications properly, and that I was vulnerable to financial exploitation by strangers. Every claim was either a complete fabrication or a twisted interpretation of normal behavior. My supposed forgetfulness was based on a single incident when I couldn't immediately remember the name of a new neighbor. My concerning financial decisions referred to my choice to remove him from my bank accounts. My hostility and paranoia was actually my appropriate anger at his manipulation and my accurate understanding of his true motives. But perhaps most infuriating was the way Marcus had enlisted others to support his case. Jennifer had provided a sworn statement describing my increasingly erratic behavior and my unreasonable resistance to help. Several neighbors had been quoted as expressing concern about my ability to live independently, though I suspected their actual comments had been taken out of context or misinterpreted. Even my own grandchildren were mentioned as witnesses to my supposed decline, though the specific examples cited were so vague as to be meaningless. The petition requested immediate emergency guardianship, arguing that I was in imminent danger, and that waiting for a full hearing would put me and others at risk. If granted, this emergency order would give Marcus immediate authority over my person and my assets, while a more comprehensive evaluation was conducted. In other words, Marcus was asking the court to strip away my rights first and determine whether that action was justified later. Attached to the petition was a report from Dr. Sandra Whitfield, a geriatric psychiatrist I had never heard of, much less met. Dr. Whitfield had conducted what she called a records review and collateral interview assessment based on information provided by Marcus and Jennifer. Without ever examining me or speaking to me directly, she had concluded that I showed signs of cognitive decline consistent with early-stage dementia, and that I lacked the capacity to make informed decisions about my care and finances. The audacity of this pseudo-evaluation left me speechless with rage. A licensed physician had signed her name to a professional opinion about my mental state, based entirely on secondhand information from people with obvious financial motives. She had never tested my memory, never assessed my problem-solving abilities, never evaluated my understanding of complex issues. Yet she felt qualified to recommend that I be stripped of my fundamental rights as an adult citizen. I forced myself to read through the entire packet twice, making notes about each claim and each piece of supposed evidence. The case Marcus had built was convincing on the surface, especially to someone who didn't know me personally. He had followed the playbook for guardianship petitions perfectly, gathering just enough documentation to create an impression of decline, while avoiding any evidence that might contradict his narrative. But I also noticed the weaknesses in his case, the gaps and inconsistencies that a careful legal defense could exploit. Most importantly, everything in the petition was based on observations and opinions rather than objective medical evidence. Marcus had no recent medical records documenting cognitive decline, no driving violations showing dangerous behavior, no financial records demonstrating poor judgment. He had built his case on hearsay and speculation, which would make it vulnerable to challenge by solid evidence of my actual competence. By 9 o'clock, I was on the phone with Robert Chen, reading him selected portions of the petition and describing the emergency hearing that was scheduled for the following Friday. His reaction was immediate and reassuring. "Louise, this is exactly what we prepared for. The petition is weaker than it appears on first reading, and we have overwhelming evidence to counter every claim Marcus has made. The fact that he's going for emergency guardianship actually works in our favor, because the standards for proving imminent danger are very high. What happens at the emergency hearing? You'll have the opportunity to appear before the judge and respond to the allegations. We'll present evidence of your competence, including all the medical and psychological evaluations you've completed. We'll also expose Marcus's financial motives and his pattern of manipulation. The judge will have to decide whether there's sufficient evidence of imminent danger to justify stripping away your rights without a full hearing. And if the judge grants the emergency guardianship, then we fight it immediately. Emergency guardianships are supposed to be temporary measures that last only until a full hearing can be conducted. We'd demand an expedited hearing and present our complete case for your competence and independence. Robert, I need to ask you something directly. Do I have a good chance of winning this?" There was a brief pause before he answered, and I appreciated his honesty. "Louise, based on everything I know about your situation and the evidence we've gathered, I believe we have an excellent chance of defeating this petition. You are clearly competent. Marcus's motives are obviously suspect, and the allegations against you are not supported by objective evidence. But I have to be honest with you. The legal system sometimes makes mistakes, especially when it comes to older adults. Judges are often overly cautious, preferring to err on the side of what they perceive as protection rather than rights. His words were sobering, but not discouraging. I had always known that this battle would be difficult, that age discrimination in the legal system was a real and significant obstacle. But I also knew that I had advantages Marcus hadn't anticipated: comprehensive medical documentation, financial resources to hire excellent legal representation, and a clear understanding of what was really at stake in this fight. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Robert and I refined our legal strategy, organized our evidence, and prepared my testimony for the hearing. We contacted the medical professionals who had evaluated me, asking them to provide written statements about my competence that could be submitted to the court. We gathered financial records showing my successful management of complex investments over many years. We compiled character references from friends, neighbors, and professional associates who could attest to my continued mental acuity and independent functioning. But perhaps most importantly, we prepared a detailed response to Dr. Whitfield's evaluation, including a point-by-point rebuttal of her conclusions and a formal complaint to the state medical board about her willingness to diagnose a patient she had never examined. Robert was particularly incensed by this aspect of Marcus's case. "What Dr. Whitfield did is not just unethical, it's potentially illegal," he explained as we reviewed her report. "She has no basis for making diagnostic statements about your mental state, and her willingness to do so suggests either gross professional incompetence or deliberate complicity in Marcus's scheme." The revelation that a licensed physician had been willing to participate in what amounted to fraud gave me new insight into the extent of Marcus's desperation. He hadn't just bent the truth or exaggerated minor concerns. He had actively sought out professionals who would provide false documentation to support his case, regardless of the ethical implications of their cooperation. Wednesday brought an unexpected development that initially filled me with dread, but ultimately strengthened my position. Marcus and Jennifer arrived at my house without warning, accompanied by a woman I didn't recognize who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson from Adult Protective Services. The sight of a government social worker on my doorstep made my heart race, but I forced myself to remain calm and dignified. "Mrs. Mitchell," Mrs. Patterson began, "I'm here to conduct a welfare check based on concerns that have been raised about your well-being. May I come in and speak with you privately?" I invited her inside while Marcus and Jennifer waited in their car, clearly hoping to avoid any direct confrontation with me. Mrs. Patterson was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that put me somewhat at ease. She explained that she was required to investigate any reports of potential elder abuse or neglect, including situations where seniors might be endangering themselves through poor judgment or declining abilities. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you some questions about your daily life and your ability to care for yourself. I also need to observe your living environment and assess whether you're safe in your current situation." For the next hour, Mrs. Patterson conducted a thorough evaluation of my home and my capabilities. She toured my house, noting its cleanliness and good repair. She reviewed my medications, observing that they were properly organized and up to date. She asked detailed questions about my daily routines, my social connections, my financial management, and my plans for the future. Throughout the interview, I answered every question clearly and completely, demonstrating my understanding of complex issues and my ability to make reasoned decisions about my care. I showed her my organized files, my detailed calendars, and my comprehensive records of medical appointments and financial transactions. I explained my recent decision to remove Marcus from my bank accounts, providing context about his financial problems and his pattern of manipulation. Mrs. Patterson listened carefully to everything I said, taking detailed notes and asking follow-up questions that suggested she was forming her own independent assessment of my situation. When she finished her evaluation, her conclusions were unambiguous. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to know that I found no evidence of self-neglect, cognitive decline, or inability to live independently. Your home is well maintained, you appear to be managing your affairs competently, and you demonstrate clear understanding of your situation and your options. I will be filing a report stating that no protective services are needed at this time. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but Mrs. Patterson wasn't finished. I also want you to know that I have some concerns about the motivation behind the complaint that brought me here. The allegations made by your son don't match what I've observed during my visit, and some of his claims about your condition appear to be significantly exaggerated. What happens to your report? It becomes part of the official record, and it will be available to the court if there are any legal proceedings related to your care. Mrs. Mitchell, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've seen many cases of adult children who genuinely need to intervene to protect their aging parents. I've also seen cases where financial motives drive family members to make false claims about their relatives' competence. Based on what I've observed today, I believe you may be dealing with the latter situation. After Mrs. Patterson left, I watched from my window as she spoke briefly with Marcus and Jennifer in their car. Even from a distance, I could see Marcus's agitation as she delivered what was obviously unwelcome news. They drove away without attempting to speak with me, but I knew this wouldn't be the end of their efforts to build a case against me. That evening, I received a phone call that provided another piece of the puzzle I was trying to solve. It was Helen, calling with information she had gathered from her son Tom about Marcus's financial situation. Louise, I asked Tom to do some more digging into Marcus's business problems, and what he found is even worse than we thought. The insurance agency isn't just struggling, it's facing fraud investigations from multiple insurance companies. Apparently, Marcus has been manipulating claims in ways that could result in criminal charges. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My son wasn't just facing bankruptcy and debt. He was potentially facing criminal prosecution for fraud. His desperate need for money wasn't just about maintaining his lifestyle or paying off creditors. It was about hiring lawyers and possibly paying restitution to avoid prison time. Helen, are you sure about this information? Tom was very specific. He said the insurance industry is a small world, and word gets around quickly when someone is under investigation. Marcus has apparently been falsifying damage reports and inflating claim values for months, maybe longer. The companies involved are building cases against him, and prosecution is almost certain. The magnitude of Marcus's desperation began to make sense. He wasn't just trying to gain access to my assets to solve routine financial problems. He was trying to save himself from potential imprisonment, and he was willing to destroy my independence and dignity to do it. But this information also provided me with powerful ammunition for the upcoming hearing. A judge would be much less likely to grant guardianship to someone who was under investigation for fraud, someone whose motives for seeking control over his mother's assets were clearly suspect. Thursday night, I sat in my living room preparing for what might be the most important day of my life. All around me were the remnants of the life Walter and I had built together. Photographs from our travels, books we had read and discussed, furniture we had chosen with care and pride. Everything I valued, everything that gave my life meaning and continuity, was at risk of being swept away by Marcus's greed and desperation. But I wasn't the same woman who had been blindsided by Marcus's manipulation just a few weeks earlier. I had educated myself about my rights, gathered evidence of my competence, and built a strong legal defense. More importantly, I had rediscovered my own strength and determination. I was Louise Mitchell, and I had never backed down from a fight that mattered. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock Friday morning. I chose my outfit with the same care I had once put into dressing for job interviews, selecting a navy blue dress with a matching jacket that projected professionalism and competence. I wanted the judge to see a woman who was clearly in control of herself and her circumstances, not the confused and declining person Marcus had described in his petition. Robert met me at the courthouse, carrying briefcases full of evidence and looking confident about our chances. "Louise, remember that you're not on trial here. Marcus is the one who has to prove his case, and the evidence he's presented is weak and circumstantial. Our job is to demonstrate your competence and expose his motives. You've done everything possible to prepare for this moment." As we walked into the courthouse, I saw Marcus and Jennifer waiting with their attorney, a sharp-looking woman who had obviously been chosen for her expertise in guardianship proceedings. They avoided eye contact with me, but I could see the tension in their posture, the nervous energy of people who weren't entirely confident in their position. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with simple wooden benches and a raised platform where Judge Hamilton presided. She was a woman in her early 60s with gray hair and intelligent eyes that suggested she had seen every variety of family drama that could be played out in her courtroom. "This is an emergency hearing on the petition for guardianship and conservatorship filed by Marcus Mitchell regarding his mother, Louise Mitchell," Judge Hamilton began. "Mr. Morrison, you represent the petitioner?" Marcus's attorney, whose name I learned was Sarah Morrison, stood to address the court. "Yes, Your Honor. We're seeking emergency guardianship due to Mrs. Mitchell's declining cognitive abilities and her refusal to accept necessary assistance with her care and financial management." "Mr. Chen, you represent Mrs. Mitchell?" Robert stood with quiet confidence. "Yes, Your Honor. We're here to demonstrate that Mrs. Mitchell is a competent adult who is being targeted by family members with serious financial motives for gaining control over her substantial assets." Judge Hamilton's eyebrows rose slightly at Robert's direct statement about financial motives, suggesting that she was already alert to the possibility that this case might not be as straightforward as the petition suggested. Ms. Morrison began by presenting Marcus's case, calling him to testify about his concerns for my well-being. As I listened to my son speak under oath about my supposed decline, I felt a mixture of sadness and disgust that was almost overwhelming. He described incidents that had never happened, quoted conversations that were fabricated or distorted beyond recognition, and painted a picture of a woman I barely recognized. According to Marcus's testimony, I had become confused about basic financial concepts, forgetting to pay bills and making impulsive purchases. I had gotten lost while driving familiar routes and had been involved in several near accidents. I had become suspicious and hostile toward family members who were trying to help me, accusing them of ulterior motives without any basis in reality. Each lie was delivered with apparent sincerity, and I could see that Marcus had convinced himself that he was doing the right thing. In his mind, he had transformed his desperate grab for my assets into a noble rescue mission, making himself the hero of a story that cast me as the victim of my own declining abilities. When it was Robert's turn to cross-examine Marcus, the real battle began. With surgical precision, Robert exposed the inconsistencies in Marcus's testimony, the lack of objective evidence for his claims, and the suspicious timing of his concerns. "Mr. Mitchell, when did you first become concerned about your mother's cognitive abilities?" "It's been a gradual process over several months, maybe longer. Yet you continued to include her in family financial discussions and relied on her advice about important decisions during this same period, didn't you?" Marcus hesitated, clearly realizing that admitting to seeking advice from someone he claimed was mentally incompetent would undermine his credibility. "Well, yes, but I was trying to be supportive and inclusive." "Mr. Mitchell, are you currently facing financial difficulties in your business?" "I object, Your Honor," Ms. Morrison interrupted. "The petitioner's financial situation is not relevant to his mother's competence." "Your Honor," Robert responded smoothly, "the petitioner's financial situation is directly relevant to his motives for seeking control over his mother's substantial assets." Judge Hamilton nodded. "Overruled. The witness will answer the question." Marcus's discomfort was obvious as he admitted to having some business challenges but denied that they had any bearing on his concerns about me. Robert pressed harder, introducing evidence of Marcus's debt, his pending fraud investigations, and his desperate need for immediate access to large amounts of money. By the time Robert finished his cross-examination, Marcus looked shaken and defensive. The confident, concerned son who had testified initially had been replaced by a man whose motives were clearly suspect and whose credibility had been severely damaged. Ms. Morrison then called Jennifer to testify, but her testimony added little to Marcus's case. She repeated many of the same allegations, but her lack of specific examples and her obvious nervousness made her appear unreliable. When Robert cross-examined her, he quickly established that she had no medical training, no expertise in assessing cognitive decline, and obvious financial motives for supporting her husband's petition. The most damaging moment for their case came when Robert introduced Mrs. Patterson's report from Adult Protective Services. The social worker's professional assessment directly contradicted every major allegation in Marcus's petition, providing official documentation that I was competent, independent, and in no need of protective services. When it was our turn to present evidence, Robert systematically dismantled every aspect of Marcus's case. He introduced my recent medical evaluations, all of which documented normal cognitive function and excellent mental health. He presented evidence of my successful financial management, including complex investment decisions that had been made within the past year. He called character witnesses who testified about my continued involvement in community activities and my clear demonstration of independent functioning. But the most powerful moment came when Judge Hamilton allowed me to testify on my own behalf. For 20 minutes, I spoke directly to the court about my life, my capabilities, and my understanding of what was really happening in this courtroom. I explained my decision to remove Marcus from my bank accounts, providing context about his financial problems and his pattern of manipulation. I described my recent activities, my future plans, and my determination to maintain my independence. As I spoke, I could see Judge Hamilton listening intently, occasionally taking notes, clearly forming her own assessment of my mental state and capabilities. When I finished, she asked me several direct questions about my understanding of the legal proceedings and my preferences for my future care. Mrs. Mitchell, do you understand the nature of the guardianship that your son is seeking? Yes, Your Honor. He wants the court to declare me mentally incompetent so that he can gain legal control over my person and my assets. He wants to strip away my rights as an adult citizen based on false claims about my mental state. And how do you feel about that possibility? Your Honor, I am a 73-year-old woman who has successfully managed her own life for over 7 decades. I have raised a family, built a career, survived the death of my husband, and maintained my independence through careful planning and hard work. The idea that I should be declared incompetent and placed under someone else's control, especially someone with obvious financial motives, is both offensive and terrifying. Judge Hamilton nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Mitchell, based on your testimony and the evidence presented here today, you appear to be a competent adult who is capable of making informed decisions about your own life. After both sides had presented their cases, Judge Hamilton announced that she would take a brief recess to review the evidence before rendering her decision. As we waited in the hallway outside the courtroom, I felt cautiously optimistic about our chances. But I also knew that the legal system could be unpredictable, especially when it came to cases involving older adults. When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Hamilton's expression was serious, but not ominous. She had clearly given careful consideration to everything she had heard and seen. This court has reviewed the petition for emergency guardianship and all evidence presented by both parties. The standard for granting emergency guardianship is very high, requiring clear and convincing evidence that the proposed ward is in imminent danger and unable to protect themselves. She paused, looking directly at Marcus and his attorney. The court finds that the petitioner has failed to meet this standard. The allegations of cognitive decline and dangerous behavior are not supported by objective medical evidence or official records. Furthermore, the court has serious concerns about the petitioner's motives for seeking guardianship, given his acknowledged financial difficulties and his urgent need for access to substantial assets. I felt my heart racing as Judge Hamilton continued. The court also notes that Mrs. Mitchell has presented compelling evidence of her continued competence, including recent medical evaluations and professional assessments that directly contradict the claims made in the petition. Judge Hamilton's gaze shifted to me, and I saw something that might have been approval in her expression. Mrs. Mitchell, you have demonstrated today that you are a competent adult who is capable of making informed decisions about your life and your assets. The court sees no basis for restricting your rights or placing you under someone else's control. Therefore, the petition for emergency guardianship is denied in its entirety. Furthermore, given the serious questions raised about the petitioner's motives and the apparent lack of merit in his claims, this court strongly discourages any future guardianship proceedings unless there is substantial new evidence of actual incapacity. The words hit me like a wave of relief so powerful that I felt momentarily dizzy. I had won. Not only had I defeated Marcus's immediate attempt to control my life, but Judge Hamilton had sent a clear message that future attempts would face serious scrutiny. As we left the courtroom, Marcus and Jennifer hurried past without speaking, their faces reflecting the shock and disappointment of a plan that had backfired completely. Robert was ebullient, congratulating me on a decisive victory and praising my testimony as one of the most effective he had ever witnessed. But for me, the victory felt bittersweet. I had saved my independence and protected my assets, but I had also lost my son in the process. The relationship that had once meant everything to me was now irreparably damaged, destroyed by Marcus's greed and his willingness to sacrifice his mother's dignity for his own financial gain. As I drove home from the courthouse, my hands steady, on the wheel and my vision clear, I reflected on everything that had happened. I had been tested in ways I never could have imagined, forced to defend my very right to exist as an independent human being. But I had emerged from that test stronger, more confident, and more determined than ever to live my life on my own terms. The war wasn't over. Marcus might still face the consequences of his fraud investigation, and there might be future attempts to challenge my independence. But I had proven to myself and to the world that Louise Mitchell was nobody's victim. I was a fighter, a survivor, and a woman who would never again allow anyone to make her feel small or powerless. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine, to travel. The weeks following the court victory passed in a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. I had won the battle for my independence, but the cost had been higher than I had anticipated. The house felt emptier somehow, not because anything physical had changed, but because the future I had once imagined, one filled with family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and the gradual building of deeper relationships with my grandchildren, had been shattered by Marcus's betrayal. But as December approached, I found myself settling into a new rhythm of life, one that was entirely my own creation. Without the constant worry about Marcus's next move, without the need to prove my competence, at every turn, I rediscovered the pleasure of simple independence. I volunteered more hours at the library, joined a book club that met at the community center, and even signed up for a watercolor painting class that I had been considering for years. It was during one of these painting sessions that I encountered someone who would help me understand just how much my victory meant beyond my own personal situation. Margaret Santos was a retired nurse who had moved to town recently to be closer to her daughter. We struck up a conversation during our first class, bonding over our mutual struggles with perspective and shading techniques. "You know," Margaret said as we cleaned our brushes after a particularly frustrating session trying to capture the light on a winter landscape, "I heard about what happened with your son from Dorothy Henderson. She mentioned you had some legal troubles with family members trying to take control of your affairs. I was initially reluctant to discuss the situation with someone I barely knew, but there was something in Margaret's expression that suggested genuine understanding rather than mere curiosity. It was a difficult time, I said carefully, but it worked out in the end. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. I went through something similar with my nephew a few years ago. He was convinced I was too old to manage my own finances, kept pressuring me to sign over power of attorney. The difference was, I gave in. I thought maybe he was right. Maybe I was getting too old to handle complex decisions. She paused, staring at her half-finished painting with obvious regret. It took me 2 years and thousands of dollars in legal fees to get my rights back. During that time, he sold my house, liquidated my investments, and moved me into a care facility that was completely inappropriate for my needs. All because I doubted myself when I should have fought back. Her story sent chills down my spine, as I realized how close I had come to a similar fate. If I had been less prepared, less determined, or simply more trusting of Marcus's supposed good intentions, I could have found myself trapped in the same nightmare that Margaret had endured. "How did you finally get free?" I asked. A social worker at the facility realized what was happening and helped me find a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases. But by then, most of the damage was done. I got my legal rights back, but I lost my home, most of my savings, and 2 years of my life. Margaret's experience put my own victory into perspective. I hadn't just saved my independence. I had avoided a trap that could have destroyed everything I had worked for over 7 decades. The strength I had found to fight Marcus hadn't just been about pride or stubbornness. It had been about survival in the most fundamental sense. As Christmas approached, I wrestled with the question of whether to reach out to Marcus and attempt some kind of reconciliation. Part of me missed the family traditions we had shared, the ritual of holiday meals and gift exchanges that had provided structure and meaning to the season. But a larger part of me recognized that those traditions had been built on a foundation that was far less solid than I had believed. The decision was made for me when Emma called 2 weeks before Christmas. Her voice was hesitant, uncertain, as if she were navigating unfamiliar territory. "Grandma, I wanted to talk to you about Christmas. Dad said you might not want to see us anymore because of everything that happened." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and I felt a surge of anger at Marcus for putting his children in the middle of a situation they couldn't possibly understand. Whatever crimes he had committed against me, involving Emma and Jake in his manipulation, was unforgivable. "Emma, sweetheart, I will always want to see you and your brother. What happened between your father and me has nothing to do with how I feel about you." "But Dad said you were angry at the whole family, that you blame us for not supporting you." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of Marcus's continued manipulation even after his legal defeat. He was still playing games, still trying to control the narrative, still attempting to position himself as the victim of my unreasonable anger. "Emma, your father and I had a serious disagreement about my ability to manage my own life. I proved in court that I am perfectly capable of making my own decisions, and the judge agreed with me. But that doesn't mean I'm angry at you or your mother or your brother." There was a long pause before Emma spoke again. "Grandma, can I ask you something? Was Dad really trying to steal your money?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. I had assumed that Marcus and Jennifer would shield the children from the uglier details of the court proceedings, but apparently Emma had been paying closer attention than anyone realized. "Emma, your father made some poor financial decisions in his business, and he thought the solution was to gain control over my money. I don't think he saw it as stealing, but that's essentially what it would have amounted to." "That's what I thought," she said quietly. "Mom and Dad have been arguing a lot about money, and I heard Dad on the phone with lawyers talking about something called fraud charges. I wasn't sure what it all meant, but it didn't sound good." My heart ached for this young girl who was trying to make sense of adult problems that were far beyond her experience. She was old enough to understand that something serious was happening, but too young to have any control over the situation. Emma, I want you to know that none of this is your fault, and it doesn't change how much I love you and Jake. If you want to see me for Christmas, I would be delighted to have you. What about Mom and Dad? Right now, I need some distance from your parents. But that doesn't mean you can't have a relationship with both them and me. You're old enough to make some of your own decisions about who you want to spend time with. We arranged for Emma and Jake to visit me on Christmas Eve, a tradition that would be new for us but felt right given the circumstances. After I hung up the phone, I realized that Marcus's betrayal had inadvertently given me something I hadn't expected: a more direct, honest relationship with my grandchildren, free from the filter of their parents' agendas and expectations. Christmas Eve with Emma and Jake turned out to be one of the most meaningful holidays I had experienced in years. Without the tension of Marcus's presence, without the underlying currents of manipulation and control, we were able to simply enjoy each other's company. We baked cookies, played board games, and talked about their school projects and future plans. But the most significant moment came when Jake, who had always been more reserved than his sister, asked me directly about the court case. Grandma, were you scared when Dad tried to have you declared incompetent? His use of the precise legal terminology surprised me, suggesting that he had been researching the situation on his own rather than relying solely on his parents' explanations. Yes, Jake, I was scared. Not because I doubted my own abilities, but because I knew that even competent people can lose their rights if they don't fight hard enough to protect them. Why do you think Dad did it? It was the question I had been dreading, the one that required me to find a balance between honesty and compassion, between protecting the children and helping them understand the reality of their situation. I think your father convinced himself that he was helping me, but his real motivation was his need for money to solve his business problems. Sometimes people do terrible things when they're desperate, even to people they love. Emma looked up from the puzzle she had been working on. Are you going to forgive him? I don't know, sweetheart. Forgiveness is complicated when someone has tried to take away everything that makes you who you are. Right now, I'm focused on rebuilding my life and maintaining relationships with the people who truly care about me. Like us? Jake asked, with a small smile. Especially like you. As winter turned to spring, I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that Marcus's legal troubles were escalating. The fraud investigation had resulted in formal charges, and he was facing the possibility of significant prison time. His insurance agency had been shut down, and he and Jennifer were reportedly struggling to pay their bills and legal expenses. Part of me felt a vindictive satisfaction at this turn of events, but a larger part simply felt sad. This was still my son, still the little boy I had raised and loved, even if he had become someone I no longer recognized. His downfall brought me no joy, only a sense of waste and regret for opportunities lost and relationships destroyed. The revelation that changed everything came in late March, during one of my regular coffee dates with Dorothy Henderson. We were sitting in her kitchen, discussing the spring garden plans, when she mentioned something that stopped me cold. Louise, I hope you don't mind me asking, but did you know about Marcus's financial problems before he started pressuring you about the guardianship? The question seemed oddly specific, and I could see in Dorothy's expression that she had something particular in mind. I suspected something was wrong, but I didn't know the full extent of his troubles until my lawyer investigated. Why do you ask? Dorothy hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to reveal. Well, Jennifer mentioned something when she was asking me questions about you last fall. She said they had been hoping you might voluntarily help them with their financial problems, but that you seemed to be getting more secretive and suspicious about money. What do you mean? She said they had planned to ask you for a loan to help save the business, but that your behavior had become so erratic that they were afraid you weren't competent to make that kind of decision. That's why they felt they had to pursue guardianship instead. The implications of Dorothy's words hit me like a thunderbolt. Marcus and Jennifer hadn't stumbled into the guardianship scheme as a desperate last resort. They had planned it from the beginning as an alternative to asking me directly for help. They had deliberately created a narrative about my declining competence to justify taking control of my assets rather than simply being honest about their needs. But what Dorothy didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I had been fully aware of Marcus's plan from almost the beginning. The phone calls I had made, the research I had conducted, the legal preparations I had put in place, none of that had been reactive scrambling in response to his petition. It had been a carefully orchestrated defense against an attack I had seen coming from miles away. The truth was that I had known about Marcus's fraud investigation weeks before he filed his guardianship petition. Helen's son Tom had warned me about the insurance company inquiries, and I had conducted my own investigation into Marcus's business practices. I had discovered the extent of his debt, the nature of his legal troubles, and the timeline for the criminal charges he was facing. More importantly, I had realized that Marcus would inevitably see my assets as the solution to his problems. I had known that he would never simply ask for help, because asking would require him to admit the extent of his failures and face the possibility of my refusal. Instead, he would look for a way to gain access to my money without my consent, probably by having me declared incompetent. So I had prepared. Every medical evaluation I had scheduled, every legal document I had organized, every conversation I had recorded, all of it had been part of a comprehensive strategy to defend against. An attack I knew was coming. I had even gone so far as to research Marcus's likely legal approach, identifying the tactics he would probably use, and preparing specific countermeasures for each one. The driving instructor I had worked with, the psychological evaluations I had undergone, the character references I had gathered. None of that had been a response to Marcus's petition. It had been preparation for a battle I had been planning for months. When Marcus finally filed his guardianship petition, I had been ready for him in ways he never could have imagined. Every argument he made had been anticipated. Every piece of evidence he presented had been countered. Every witness he called had been discredited. I had known exactly what he was going to do, because I had researched his strategy extensively and prepared for every possibility. The woman Marcus thought he was manipulating, confused, declining, vulnerable to his schemes, had never existed. I had been in complete control of the situation from beginning to end, allowing him to believe he was successfully deceiving me while I built an impregnable defense against his attack. Even the timing of my bank visit had been calculated. I hadn't gone to remove Marcus from my accounts in a moment of sudden realization or defensive panic. I had planned that move weeks in advance, waiting for the optimal moment to send him a message that would force him to accelerate his timeline and file his petition before he was fully prepared. In essence, I had played Marcus like a chess master, manipulating an overconfident amateur. Every move he made had been anticipated. Every strategy he employed had been countered. Every advantage he thought he possessed had been neutralized by superior preparation and deeper understanding of the game we were playing. The final irony was that Marcus had been right about one thing. Someone in our family had been engaged in careful, long-term planning to control another person's assets. He just hadn't realized that person was me, and the assets I was protecting were my own. As I sat in Dorothy's kitchen, absorbing the full significance of what she had told me, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Not because I had defeated Marcus, but because I had proven to myself that Louise Mitchell was nobody's victim. I was a strategist, a fighter, and a woman who had never lost a battle that truly mattered. The moral lesson in all of this wasn't just about the importance of fighting for your independence or the danger of trusting family members with obvious ulterior motives. It was about the power of preparation, the value of thinking several moves ahead, and the strength that comes from truly understanding your own worth. Marcus had underestimated me because he saw only what he wanted to see, an aging woman who could be manipulated and controlled. He had never bothered to really know the person he was trying to deceive, never recognized the intelligence and determination that had carried me through 7 decades of challenges and changes. But I had known exactly who I was dealing with. I had understood Marcus's character, his motivations, and his likely actions better than he understood them himself. And that knowledge had given me the ultimate advantage in a game where the stakes were nothing less than my freedom and dignity. As spring bloomed around me and I tended to my garden with hands that were steady and strong, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. I had lost a son, but gained a deeper understanding of my own strength. I had faced betrayal, but discovered reserves of courage I hadn't known I possessed. I had been tested in ways I never could have imagined, and had emerged victorious. The road ahead was mine to travel, and I intended to make the most of every mile. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.